Hello guys, welcome back. This is RandoGEEK. Alright guys, so we have some big news regarding T-Mobile. Alright, the article is coming from Light Reading. The link will be down below in the description for you guys. But big news here coming from T-Mobile and developing story, okay? Because we're definitely going to hear more about this, which is why I'm referring it to as a developing story. But of course, breaking news nonetheless. Alright? T-Mobile to buy up to $3.3 billion of Comcast's 600 MHz spectrum. That's the headline here. Diving into the article, T-Mobile agreed to purchase some or potentially all of Comcast's 600 MHz spectrum holdings. So this deal's value sits between $1.2 billion and $3.3 billion, they're saying. And now that is depending on how much spectrum T-Mobile will ultimately walk away with. So the deal would represent a step back for Comcast from the mobile market because of selling its 600 MHz spectrum would reduce Comcast's ability to operate its own wireless network. However, Comcast still owns spectrum in the 3.5 GHz CBRS spectrum band, and it has begun testing its own wireless network in that band in Philadelphia using equipment from Samsung. So for T-Mobile, the agreement would significantly expand its existing 600 MHz operations. It also signals T-Mobile's seemingly endless appetite for spectrum, considering the company just a year ago announced it would pay Columbia Capital $3.5 billion for other 600 MHz spectrum licenses covering around 100 million people in major markets like Boston and Los Angeles. So according to the financial analysts with New Street Research, the new transaction between T-Mobile and Comcast helps clarify the rising value of spectrum overall. So, according to the New Street analysts, they wrote in a statement that if Comcast sells the entire portfolio, the price of $3.3 billion implies $2.21 per megahertz pop. Alright? They wrote this statement shortly after T-Mobile disclosed the transaction. So the per megahertz pop calculation is applied to most spectrum transactions and reflects the number of people covered compared with the amount of spectrum available, though it can be affected by a wide variety of factors. So they go on to say that this is a 102% increase over what Comcast paid for the portfolio at auction. This compares to a 103% increase in the portfolio that Columbia Capital agreed to sell to T-Mobile in August of last year. Comcast won the 600 MHz licenses in an FCC auction in 2017 for around $1.7 billion, and they're saying that the Comcast transaction confirms that spectrum values have doubled in the 6 years since the auction. The New Street analyst added that the mid-band spectrum values have probably increased at an even bigger rate when compared with low-band spectrum like 600 MHz. So, T-Mobile disclosed its new transaction with Comcast in a SEC filing. The company said that Comcast agreed to sell $1.2 billion worth of 600 MHz spectrum licenses covering around 39 people living in New York, Orlando, Florida, Kansas City, Missouri, and other markets. So those markets are outside Comcast's cable footprint. However, Comcast said it might also sell spectrum licenses covering 110 million people in cities including Chicago, Illinois, San Francisco, California, Baltimore, Maryland, Boston, Massachusetts, Miami, Florida, Nashville, Tennessee, and other markets. Those markets are inside Comcast's cable footprint. So if Comcast eventually decides to sell those additional licenses, that would bump up the total value of the deal from $1.2 billion to $3.3 billion. So now Comcast must decide whether it wants to sell those additional licenses by 2027. The deal is scheduled to close in 2028, they're saying. Alright, so we are surprised that Comcast is unsure that they want to part with the spectrum in home markets at this stage, according to the New Street analysts. They also say that it suggests the utility they have found in their testing may be more compelling than we had assumed. They're saying that this may sound counterintuitive. After all, they are selling, but based on our starting point, they said that they thought that they had parted with the spectrum unconditionally rather than conditionally. So at this stage, Comcast is not giving up any strategic value. They have locked in a price for the spectrum with a put option if they decide they don't need it. and they are collecting a small lease payment while they ponder the future. So while T-Mobile awaits Comcast's decision, it is leasing Comcast spectrum for what New Street estimates to be around $50 million a year. So what does this mean for T-Mobile? T-Mobile's 5G network mainly works across its 2.5 GHz and 600 MHz spectrum holdings. So the 600 MHz portion covers wide geographic areas, while the 2.5 GHz portion supports speedy connections, transmitting lots of data. So the more spectrum the company applies to its network, the more customers it can support with snappy connections. Alright, so the New Street analysts say, we think T-Mobile is aiming for 40 MHz of 600 MHz everywhere. Prior to this transaction, they had 40 MHz in 76% of markets, so that's 316 out of 416 markets. Their shortfall was mostly in the top 50 markets. So the Columbia Capital transaction mostly filled gaps in the top 50 markets, taking them from having 40 MHz in just 15% of the top 50 markets to having 40 MHz in 40% of the top 50 markets. So the analysts go on to say that if all licenses transfer, this transaction will fill in the gaps with T-Mobile in 23 of the top 50 markets. So that's going to be taking them from the 20 MHz to 30 MHz range in 15 markets, and then from 30 MHz to 40 MHz in an additional 8 markets. So they said that they think filling these gaps is the primary driver of the transaction for T-Mobile. So they're saying that T-Mobile has been buying spectrum at an astounding rate. So here are the rates here based on years, on the yearly dates. So in 2020, T-Mobile walked away with roughly $1 billion worth of millimeter wave spectrum access across several FCC auctions. So in 2021, T-Mobile purchased roughly $10 billion worth of C-band spectrum in another FCC auction. In 2022, T-Mobile then purchased around $3 billion worth of 3.45 GHz spectrum in another FCC auction. Then near the end of 2022, T-Mobile spent around $304 million in the FCC's auction of 2.5 GHz spectrum, and then finally in the middle of last year, it agreed to buy 600 MHz licenses from Columbia Capital for $3.5 billion. So Mike Sievert said, "We've never met spectrum we didn't like." So that's a very bold statement here. So once again, huge news. So what do you guys think about this? We know that T-Mobile wants to fill in those gaps, get those speedy connections to a lot of areas that are lacking. There's a lot of rural areas that need it. There's a lot of city areas that need it. Do you think that this would actually fill in the gaps between T-Mobile and the loopholes that are in their network? Do you think that this would actually patch up a lot of the bad quality areas, the areas that are just not performing good enough? What do you guys think? I think that this is a huge deal for them. Either way, I think it's definitely going to increase their network. It's going to increase the value of the network because there's going to be a lot more stronger connectivity, without a doubt. But I'd like to know what your comments are. I'd like to know what you guys think of this whole situation. Feel free to let me know down below. All right, so like I said, developing story. We're definitely going to hear more about this. Let's see what Comcast says. Let's see if they move forward with this deal. I think T-Mobile would definitely benefit greatly from this. I think it will do nothing but good for the network. But I'd like to hear what you guys have to say. Let me know down below. When the updates come, you guys will get notified. Alright guys, as always, thanks so much for stopping by. If you can do me a favor, hit that like button on your way out. It lets me know that you like the news on the channel. It shows me that you guys are enjoying it. Thank you so much for your time. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.